Hello guys, welcome back to another episode of the Whisky Diaries. My name is Malt Lane. We're here at Death and Taxes, and today we're going to be talking about Benriach 21 Peated Whisky Temporis. A little bit of history. Like always, Benriach is a whiskey distillery that got created in 1898, 3 years after they opened Longbourn. Benriach and Longbourn was created by John Duff in the middle of the whiskey boom, or at the end of the whiskey boom, really. The whiskey boom happened in the late 1900s because of the phylloxera disease in France. Phylloxera was a little fungus that basically killed all vineyards around France, so the brandies and the wines basically was a massive, well, it actually attacked all over Europe, but there was a massive shortage all over the UK and Scotland. At that time, brandy outsold whiskey by a lot. So when the brandy and the cognac basically started being supplied, whiskey started being drunk instead. But like any booms, by the late 1900s and the beginning of the 20th century, basically it just collapsed, and a lot of distilleries started going broke or closed down. Benriach didn't close down completely, but they did stop producing whiskey in their own bottles. They started basically producing whiskey for the Longbourn distillery and the malting floors being used then. They didn't start making whiskey till the 1960s, when Seagram took over the distilleries and they started producing some single malts. But again, most of the whiskey was being produced for blends back in the day. Now in the 80s, got taken over by Pedro Ximénez. In 2000, three master distillers took over Glenronach, Glengosa and Benriach. And then in 2016, Brown-Forman bought them all out. Two of the master distillers stayed on site just to help out, but they also got a new master blender and so on and so on. Now, the Benriach in the late 1970s, they actually started producing one of the first distillers to start producing peated malt in the Highlands. In the 70s and the 80s, the whiskey industry was still struggling to make people understand what a single malt was, until Glenfiddich in the 80s changed all of that. But until then, making a Highland malt that it was peated is actually quite revolutionary back then, because nobody thought that it would sell well. To be honest, even nowadays, there's not that many Highland malts that are peated. You got Glenronach, Glenronach does a couple, and then you got Benriach and a couple of others here and there. But back in the day, Highland peated whiskey was only being supplied for blends. Now, the Benriach, the 21-year-old Benriach Peated it's called the Temporis. All Benriach whiskies that are peated, they have a Latin name. We did a review of the 10-year-old that is called Curiositas. That is a great whiskey. This one is called Temporis. The reason why they started doing this one is just to kind of like, they wanted to replicate what the Highland malts were back in the late 1800s when this distillery was first opened. This one in particular, like Benriach, so Benriach, the distillery itself, they have been experimenting with a lot of different casks, and because of this, basically a lot of the whiskies that they do, especially the core range, they are a maturation. It's a blend between 4 different casks that they all have been at least aged for 21 years. In this particular case, it's all peated whiskey that has been aged in bourbon barrels, virgin oak, Oloroso, and Pedro Ximénez sherry casks. So basically 2 American oak and 2 sherry casks. The virgin oak is quite interesting to note, because virgin oak is basically what they do in bourbon in America. In America, to be able to call a bourbon, you have to age it in brand new American oak. So nothing in the bourbon, nothing in the cask before you put any whiskey in it. Now this is all good and well in America, but in Scotland they don't really like doing that. Not many distilleries like using the fresh American oak, because that imparts a lot of flavour, and sometimes it actually destroys the whiskey with too much wood. So it's sparingly used, and you have to know what you're doing. So that's quite interesting as well. The Oloroso is a style of sherry that we talked in previous videos. It's kind of like more like a dry style of sherry, not like as dry as Fino, but less sweet than your Pedro Ximénez. And Pedro Ximénez sherry is a very, very sweet, kind of like, think like port, but even more sweet. That is mainly dessert wine as well, and imparts sherry always imparts a pretty particular spicy aromas to the whiskey. This is bottled at 46% ABV. Most whiskies from the core range of Benriach is non-chill filtered, and they're all bottled at 46% ABV, which I personally like. 46% is that kind of like sweet spot, which is not too strong, not too bland, and it still carries the whiskey really well. I personally really like that between 46-47% ABV it's a great one. A little bit of specs on the distillery itself. They produce 2 million liters a year. They have four stills, 2 wash and 2 spirit still. The mash comes out of the ferment for 48 to 50 hours, and the first and the neutral grain spirit comes at like about 68 ABV. None of this is worth really. It's not groundbreaking. Is quite standard for a Highland malt to have these specifications, and that's what they're trying to do. Honestly, Benriach has been trying to do a classic Highland style, no fuss, pretty straightforward whiskey, which is not bad. So like, sometimes you want something special, sometimes you want something pretty easy drinking, and this is it. The peat for the whiskey itself, they usually malt it at about 55 ppm, which is basically what Laphroaig and Ardbeg and a lot of the whiskies from most smoky whiskies do. But because the malting actually happens from with peat from the mainland, it actually is not as iodine and it's not as strong as what you will get from the island whiskies. It's actually quite soft, and it's a great whiskey just to make people learn how to drink peated whiskey. There it goes. It's wow, that's very traditional. Like it's a very classic style of nose from Highlands. Like you get like the pears and the apples, poached pears, and obviously the older you get, like those freshness, those grassy fresh fruit, the older it gets, it started to become more like a caramelized style, like a poached pears or poached apples. And the smoke is very subtle on this. It's not, again, it's not something that you slap you in the face, kind of like as soon as you smell Laphroaig, you go, wow, that's insane. This one is just, it's there, but it's very subtle. It's kind of like having like being standing far away from a beach fire or something. Like you get like subtle smells from it. Oh, that's delicious as well. You get the apples and you get the pears, but then after that you get the spices that you usually get from Pedro Ximénez and sherry casks. Like a little bit of nutmeg, a little bit of cinnamon on the back. So it's actually delicious whiskey. Very wealthy. But it's definitely worth getting this for your back home. It's a very good all-rounded whiskey, this one. So thanks for listening, guys. We'll catch you next time, and if you have any recommendations or any whiskies that you want reviewed, please do it on the comments and give us a like. Slàinte mhath.